Hi everyone, welcome. What I have out here on the bench are my so-called original red wigglers, and I refer to them that way because they're the worms that I feel like I can really track back to my very first batch of worms. I had seen that population dwindle down to just a tiny fraction of what I originally had, and then I was able to nurse their population back up. It was most recently when we launched these two bins over here 34 days ago that we actually took a single bin and we split the population into two bins here. And it was during the last check-in 12 days ago, or was it 11? I got notes here. Here it is. The last feeding and check-in was 11 days ago where we did the final addition of worms. So I was able to do the final haul out of worms from the system that they came from. And then I added that number to the original estimate, and now I've got some finalized figures here, or more or less finalized. I suppose if somebody still watches one of my videos or the last video and provides some additional estimates for how many worms I added, then I'll change the numbers. But we've got almost exactly the same number of worms living in these two systems, where it looks like only 9 away from being perfectly even in terms of worms living in the two systems. So I wanted to just get back in here and give them another feeding. 11 days have passed since that last feeding, and I'm assuming that they're due, considering that we've got a couple systems that are fairly well populated. So let's uncover here and get to the business of feeding these little guys. For a system that's only not even 5 weeks old yet, for a couple systems that are not even 5 weeks old yet, we're now up to feeding number 4. I'm just sort of judging from the weight and the feel of these two feeding zone indicators that I just removed. It did seem like the one I picked up off of here was heavier, more damp. So that might be an indication that we've got a little bit more moisture going on in here. In these newer systems, I'm not too concerned with moisture levels being pretty high, because I know that we're dealing with systems that are chock full of fresh bedding, more or less fresh bedding. But I've been very weary about letting my systems get overly muddy and damp. So even though we started out here with bubble wrap coverings on both systems, I am prepared to switch over at any time if we feel that the moisture level's too high, and just swap out those plastic coverings for something that'll actually permit a little bit more airflow and evaporation. I know there's not a lot of evaporation going on when the weather is hot and humid like it is now. The high humidity and the saturation of moisture in the air really does tend to stifle the evaporation that I tend to see, say, in the winter time when my furnace is running and the heat's on. That system really dries the air in the house out considerably, so I do feel like in the winter time I'm even supplementing moisture in my bins by coming in with spray bottle, and definitely keeping the systems covered with plastic to prevent evaporation. But this time of year it's quite the opposite, where I feel like I've got to be careful not to allow systems to get overly damp. Systems like this that still have lots and lots of bedding and only a small percentage of castings accumulating, I don't think that there's a huge amount of concern for allowing systems to stay a little bit more damp. So I'm seeing nothing here that tells me it's time to remove the plastic coverings. And most of my systems that are a little bit older than these, I've already progressed to the point where I'm seeing enough of a concentration of castings in the systems that an excess amount of moisture would tend to cause that material to start getting muddy and clumping together and becoming less fluid and crumbly. But in systems like this, where we've still got a pretty high concentration of bedding materials, I don't think we're at that point where we're at the risk of seeing stuff getting muddy or clumpy. So I'm already getting the sense that returning with the bubble wrap coverings here will be just fine. I just figured we would maybe start here with examining the outskirts of both systems first, and then we can make our way down into the middle and excavating a hole where we could drop in today's feeding. So now stuff I've got for them came out of the freezer perhaps an hour ago. So it is probably for the most part thawed out. It's just an assortment of different vegetables and stuff. A lot of it is just the tops of scallions. You know, with scallions you would normally just eat the part that's underground and the part that's above ground, the leaves and the stem. I don't know what they refer to that as, stalk, whatever. Those are all stuff that would normally end up in the trash, but around here, very little stuff that can be composted ends up in the trash. Most of it ends up in my freezer in preparation for that day somewhere in the near future when the worms will be able to get access to it. So now, we've definitely not seen a huge number of worms in the outskirts of these two systems. But I think when we get down to the middle, that's where we're going to see a somewhat larger quantity of worms hanging out. The population was boosted, I believe, in bin number 2. This is bin number 2, right? Is this the one that we released worms into? No, bin number 1, I think. I'm trying to remember. I did scrub through the video from last time quickly, and something tells me it might have been this system that we released the additional worms into, because those extra, I don't know how many worms that we just added last time were placed into here, because this was the bin that was thought to have the slightly lower population, but now, is it bin number 1? Yeah, bin number 1 has taken over as the bin thought to have possibly the greater number of worms living in it. Oops, just glare. I wasn't paying attention, but I glanced over at my preview screen to show me what's on the camera. So hopefully you saw the numbers again there. So yeah, systems that have this many worms living in them, in excess of 2,200 worms in them, do a nice job. You know, a lot of people would say that a bin this size should be launched with perhaps 1,000 worms as a best practice if you want to see some pretty good action, but if you double that, then the worms are definitely going to work through the stuff you give them pretty quickly. It does seem like they're doing that here. I think now if we kind of start to go right down near the bottom where a lot of the moisture tends to drop in, we'll start to see a little bit more worm action. I think some of the stuff that we put in here was cardboard. Each system we had laid a chunk of cardboard down right beneath the foods that were added. So there's a piece of it right there, pretty good sized piece. Here's another one. The cardboard, everything in the bin will eventually get consumed by the worms. But the stuff like paper and cardboard are originally placed into the system with the designation of being bedding for the most part. Although technically it all just becomes their food. So if we find large chunks of stuff that could be reused as bedding beneath the foods that we apply, then we'll set those aside and use them when we rebuild the feeding zones. I just found one of the little remnants of the last feeding. Each system was given 3 banana peels last time, as well as a couple other things, but mainly banana peel was the main menu item. Here's the stem of one of them. Maybe we'll bump into a couple more as we work our way through. I thought I might find more, because sometimes after only 11 days of being in the bin, a banana peel will tend to still remain as leftovers. But we've got a pretty good sized population in these systems, so they've done a good job working down that last feeding. And it wasn't that much, you know, if you think about it. 3 banana peels, maybe a little bit of coffee was sprinkled in as well. It's not a whole lot, and the worms are just going to rip through that stuff, although I figured I would find the stems of a couple other ones, and there we go. As I just talked about it, the second one appeared. And chances are there's a third one in here too. So if those other 2 didn't get broken down completely, then the third one should be there too, and there it is. So I wasn't dead set on trying to find every last bit of leftovers from the last feeding, but it would appear that we've more or less unearthed all of it at this point. So let's go ahead and try to clear out this feeding zone too, so we can get to the business of resetting and feeding. So here's another good size hunk of the cardboard laid down beneath their feeding last time. I'm almost getting that sense like some of what I'm seeing down here might even be leftovers of the coffee that was put in. And here, this is kind of what I was expecting to find. Here's the stem of one of the banana peels, but still a pretty good clear sign of some of the leftovers of the peels themselves. There's another piece. I didn't really bump into anything like that over in bin number 1. So for whatever reason, it does seem like they were able to manage to work down that stuff considerably better in bin number 1 than in bin number 2. And you can see down here a good number of worms hanging out down in the feeding area. Here's some more paper type stuff that would have been some of the bedding we applied with the last feeding. And I think if we find a couple other banana stems down here, it wouldn't be surprising. But we're not going to force it. We're not going to delay the reset of today's feeding in search of a couple banana stems. But I wouldn't be surprised if we did bump into them. I was just sort of getting into the collection of leftovers on one side and stuff we could cover up with over near me. So we've already got 2 of the banana stems. I just located a second one and added it to the collection. So it wouldn't be too surprising if we found a third one here. But like I said, I'm not going to prolong the reset here any longer. I think we're pretty much at the point where we can come back in and begin with the rebuild of the feeding area. That to me looks like it could be the leftover of a banana stem too, but it's so heavily worked it seems unlikely that it's gotten that far in only 11 days. Perhaps that's the banana stem from an older feeding that goes back further in the past. But I think we've managed to excavate pretty good down into both systems, leaving us plenty of room to drop in today's feeding. I was questioning whether I would want to maybe supplement the bedding in today's feeding with more, but as you can see, I'm pretty near the rim of the containers here as I pile stuff up, and I do want to avoid, building out the material in any of my bins to the point where I'm robbing myself of the space that I like to have on standby to do this sort of stuff. So I think what we'll do is we're going to maybe add just a tiny bit of fresh bedding, which is really going to just be the old feeding zone indicators, since part of what I've got for them is a couple of new replacement feeding zone indicators, a couple other coffee filters that we could use at the very end to mark where we last fed, which is usually just down the middle in most cases in my systems. Sometimes I alter the location of the feeding area a little bit and move it around from this place to that place. But I think we're just going to stick to the status quo here for the most part and return all the old foods down into where the feeding zone was and reset right where it was previously. So here's the replacement coffee filters, which are now no longer going to be seen as coffee filters, but rather feeding zone indicators. And then, as you can see, I've got quite a bit of this scallion here and a few other things. It's mainly scallion, but you can see some radish in here as well. So let's just see about being fair in divvying out the portions here. When I first pulled this stuff out of the freezer, it didn't seem like all that much, but the way the stuff is all just resting up against itself, stacked in here pretty dense, it is quite a bit. And it doesn't have a great deal of weight to it, it just looks like a lot. Oh yeah, and then there's these weird crackers. I think it's for the most part flour. They just kind of were baked into this interesting little form, but they've been laying around here in my kitchen for some time now. And it's time that we did something with it other than just avoid it and have it taking up space in my kitchen, so it's time to give it to the worms. This stuff I'm sprinkling in is my worm chow. And then this other stuff that I want to sprinkle in as well is grit, which is just pulverized eggshell. And I think what is left in this little container could simply go right in here. So I've got more that I could replenish my little application container with. So I've got more. We'll just reset and reload those two. So that's pretty much it for our feeding today. I'm just looking around to see if there's anything I forgot. I gave them the food, I gave them the grit, And I think we're ready to cover up. So yeah, there was just that one little tiny bit of extra supplemental bedding. The old feeding zone indicators getting repurposed since we had replacements for them. And I think that's fine, because if you look around, you can certainly see tons and tons of shredded paper and cardboard everywhere within this system. And you know, for less than 5 weeks of age, that's perfectly normal. But these are pretty heavily populated bins, and I wouldn't be surprised if, you know, the couple thousand worms that live in here are already hard at work reproducing and trying to increase their numbers even further. It's usually this time of year when things get a little bit warmer that I start seeing that happen in most of my systems. As long as the worms can sense that there's ample room for more worms, they'll happily grow their numbers. And my hope is that that's what we're going to see here as well with my original worms. It's kind of nice that I've now been able to expand them into 2 separate containers, so that if God forbid anything were to happen to one of the containers, I've got a little bit of a backup here. But I've been really careful, hoping that I can avoid any sort of mishaps like that in the future. And you know, besides putting on the bubble wrap to cover things over here, I've got a couple pieces of newspaper too. Something I like to do usually is to have a nice sort of covering out on the top of my systems, and you know, I'm wondering if we could just put them in folded over double. They're already so large in size that putting them in this way will almost cover the entire surface. If I were to unfold them and put them in all the way, the sides of it would roll up the sides, and then we'd have even more coverage, but I don't think we need it quite that much. I think this is going to be a nice setup here. I'll be curious to see what becomes of these pieces of paper. Usually the moisture in the bin that would normally evaporate out to the atmosphere gets caught on these plastic coverings and recirculates beneath the plastic, causing a good bit of moisture to any sort of material right beneath it. So these pieces of paper will normally get quite damp, leading it to become a place where the worms really enjoy coming up to hang out on. So I have a feeling next time we come out here, the coverings will be pretty damp and pretty busy with worm traffic. But I can't guarantee it, because a lot of times I anticipate something like that and I forecast it, and then the worms always prove me wrong. So we'll just have to see. Alright everyone, that's it for our check-in with the original red worms. Bins are both doing really nicely. I'm glad to see that. And that's it for the video. Hopefully you enjoyed it. If you did, as always, please don't forget to leave me a quick thumbs up before you go. That's always really appreciated. If you haven't done so already, please also consider subscribing to the channel. That's really appreciated as well. Alright everyone, have a great day. Thanks for watching. Bye now.